Sometimes life gives us a second chance when we least expect it. Sometimes that chance comes in the form of an old donkey pulling a weathered cart down a dusty road. When aging cowboy Frank spotted the lone animal struggling with its burden, he thought he was just helping a lost beast. But inside that cart waited something that would change everything he thought he knew about his past. A tattered quilt, a rusted music box, letters revealing a son he never knew existed, a son who had just passed away, leaving behind one final hope that this donkey would find its way to the father who never came home. What do you do when you discover the life you could have lived? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Garrison had always believed that a man's life could be measured by the weight of his saddlebags. His own bags, crafted from leather that had seen 40 years of desert sun and mountain snow, hung heavy with the accumulated treasures of a solitary existence. They contained the practical necessities: a worn Bible, a flask half filled with whiskey, tools for mending fence and tack, but hidden in a secret compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a single photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that had once made him believe in forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank's modest ranch, painting the adobe walls of his small house in shades of amber and gold. At 72, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to respect his body's limitations while refusing to surrender to them. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of rope burns and barbed wire encounters, were still steady as he prepared Thunder's morning feed. Thunder, his 20-year-old quarter horse, nickered softly at Frank's approach. The horse had been with him for 15 years now, and they had developed the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared hardship and mutual respect. Frank ran his hand along Thunder's neck, feeling the familiar ridge of an old scar from a rattlesnake bite they had survived together in the Sonoran desert. "Getting old, aren't we, partner?" Frank murmured, his voice carrying the rasp of too many campfire nights and dusty trails. Thunder's response was a gentle nudge against Frank's shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become their morning ritual. The ranch itself was small by Texas standards, just 40 acres of scrubland bordered by mesquite and prickly pear. Frank had bought it with his rodeo winnings, back when his knees could still handle the punishment of bronc riding, and his heart was too proud to settle down. The house was simple but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh desert climate and the even harsher solitude of its owner. Frank's daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. After tending to Thunder and the handful of cattle that provided modest income, he would sit on his front porch with a cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint, watching the desert wake up around him. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional cactus or the distant outline of the Chisos Mountains. It was a landscape that demanded respect and offered little in return except the hard-won wisdom that came from learning to be alone with your thoughts. The nearest town, Redemption Flats, lay 8 miles to the north, a name that Frank had always found ironically appropriate. Once a thriving cattle town, it now struggled to maintain a population of 300 souls, most of them as weathered and stubborn as the desert itself. The main street, lined with false-fronted buildings that had seen better decades, served as a reminder of boom times long past. Henderson's General Store, the post office, May's Diner, and Doc Fleming's medical practice represented the remaining pillars of a community that refused to die gracefully. May Sullivan ran the diner with the fierce determination of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and wasn't about to let economic reality close her doors. She was Frank's age, with silver hair that she wore in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. May had been trying to feed Frank a proper meal for the better part of a decade, convinced that his bachelor cooking would eventually be the death of him. "Frank Garrison, you look like a scarecrow that's been left out in the rain too long," she would say whenever he appeared in her diner, usually after a particularly harsh stretch of solitary living. May represented everything Frank thought he wanted to avoid, the comfort of routine companionship, the gentle domesticity that reminded him of what he had walked away from all those years ago. Doc Fleming, on the other hand, offered a different kind of companionship. The old physician had arrived in Redemption Flats 15 years earlier, seeking the same kind of solitude that had drawn Frank to the desert. During their monthly checkups, which May had insisted upon after Frank's heart episode 3 years prior, the two men would sit in comfortable silence, each understanding that some wounds healed better without constant examination. "You're strong as an old boot, Frank," Doc Fleming would say after listening to Frank's heart and checking his blood pressure. "But even old boots wear out eventually. Might be time to think about what comes next." Frank always deflected such conversations with a grunt or a change of subject. The truth was, he had been thinking about what came next, and the prospect filled him with a restlessness he couldn't quite name. At 72, he was acutely aware that his best years were behind him, that the choices he had made in his youth were now set in stone. The photograph in his saddlebags served as a daily reminder of the road not taken, the life he might have lived if pride and fear hadn't driven him away from the only woman who had ever truly known him. Sarah Martinez had been 25 when they met at a rodeo in San Antonio. Frank was 38 then, still chasing the dream of national championships and believing that the next ride would be the one to make his reputation. Sarah worked as a teacher in a small school outside the city, but on weekends she would come to the rodeos with her sister. Drawn by the excitement and the danger that surrounded the rough men who made their living on the backs of wild horses and bulls, Frank could still remember the first time he saw her, standing at the rail of the practice pen, her dark hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. She wasn't like the buckle bunnies who followed the circuit, seeking the temporary thrill of romance with cowboys. Sarah had substance, depth, a quiet intelligence that made Frank feel simultaneously inspired and inadequate. Their courtship had been a series of stolen moments between rodeos, long conversations over coffee in all-night diners, walks along dusty trails where Frank would tell her about his dreams of owning land and raising horses. Sarah listened with the patience of someone who understood that dreams were sacred things, not to be judged or dismissed lightly. For 3 years, they had lived in a state of suspended possibility. Frank would leave for weeks at a time, following the rodeo circuit across Texas and the Southwest, while Sarah waited patiently in San Antonio, teaching her students and tending her small garden. When he returned, they would pick up their relationship as if no time had passed, falling back into the comfortable rhythm of two people who belonged together. But Frank had never been able to make the final commitment. Something in him, pride, fear, or perhaps just the restless spirit that had driven him to the rodeo in the first place, kept him from proposing marriage. He told himself he needed one more season, one more chance at the national championship that would prove his worth. Sarah deserved a man who could provide for her properly, he reasoned, not some broken-down cowboy with uncertain prospects. The end had come suddenly, as these things often do. Frank had suffered a particularly bad fall in Amarillo, breaking 3 ribs and separating his shoulder. As he lay in the hospital, staring at the ceiling and contemplating his mortality, he realized that rodeo was a young man's game, and he was no longer young. The smart thing would be to return to Sarah, use his savings to buy a small ranch, and settle into the kind of quiet domestic life that most men his age would envy. Instead, Frank had written Sarah a letter, a coward's letter. He knew now, explaining that he wasn't ready for marriage and might never be. He told her she deserved better than a worn-out cowboy with more scars than sense. He mailed the letter from a truck stop outside Lubbock and never looked back, carrying her memory like a physical weight in the secret compartment of his saddlebags. Now, 34 years later, Frank lived with the consequences of that choice. His ranch was paid for, his life was orderly and predictable, and he had achieved the independence he thought he wanted. But in the pre-dawn hours, when sleep eluded him and the desert silence pressed against his ears like a living thing, Frank wondered if freedom was just another word for the cage he had built around his heart. The desert had a way of amplifying such thoughts, of turning them over and over until they became smooth as river stones. Frank had learned to live with regret the way other men lived with arthritis, as a constant, manageable pain that occasionally flared into something more acute. He told himself that Sarah had probably married someone else, raised a family, lived the kind of full life that he had been too stubborn and too scared to offer her. As Thunder finished his morning grain, Frank allowed himself the luxury of imagining what might have been. Sarah with silver in her hair, grandchildren playing in a yard filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of laughter. A life measured not by solitude and self-reliance, but by the accumulated weight of shared experiences and mutual devotion. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of morning coolness and reminding Frank that speculation was a luxury he couldn't afford. There were fences to mend, cattle to check, and the daily business of keeping a small ranch afloat in an unforgiving landscape. He adjusted his worn hat, checked the contents of his saddlebags, and prepared to face another day in the life he had chosen, a life that was about to be forever changed by an encounter with a persistent donkey on a dusty trail. The heat of midday had settled over the desert like a heavy blanket. When Frank first heard the sound, a faint metallic chiming carried on the hot wind. He reined Thunder to a halt and listened, his weathered face creased with concentration. The sound came again, rhythmic and mournful, like wind chimes hanging from an abandoned porch. Frank had been riding the fence line between his property and the old Hartwell place, checking for breaks after the previous week's thunderstorm. The abandoned ranch next door had been empty for 5 years now, ever since old Pete Hartwell passed away and his children sold off the cattle and moved to Phoenix. The land stretched wild and untended, slowly returning to its natural state of mesquite and prickly pear. The chiming grew louder as Frank topped a small rise, and what he saw below made him pull Thunder up short. A donkey, grey with age and fatigue, struggled along the dusty trail that marked the boundary between the two properties. The animal was harnessed to a weathered cart, its wooden wheels grinding through the sand with obvious difficulty. Hanging from the harness, a set of tarnished wind chimes caught the desert breeze, creating the haunting melody that had drawn Frank's attention. But what struck Frank most was the absence of any human guide. The donkey moved with purpose, as if following some internal compass. But there was no rider, no one walking alongside. No sign of anyone who might have abandoned the animal to its struggle. Frank urged Thunder down the slope, approaching slowly so as not to startle the exhausted beast. As he drew closer, he could see the donkey's labored breathing, the way its head hung low with exhaustion, the dark patches of sweat that stained its grey coat. The cart itself looked ancient, held together with wire and determination, its wooden sides bleached white by years of desert sun. "Easy there, old fellow," Frank called softly, dismounting from Thunder and approaching on foot. The donkey raised its head at the sound of his voice, revealing dark eyes that held an almost human intelligence. For a moment, the two animals regarded each other across the shimmering heat, one carrying the burden of age and isolation, the other bearing some mysterious cargo through the endless desert. Frank extended his hand, allowing the donkey to catch his scent before gently touching its neck. The animal's skin quivered under his touch, but it didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to lean into the contact, as if grateful for the first human kindness it had experienced in days. "Where's your owner, friend?" Frank murmured, running his hand along the donkey's neck and checking the harness for any clues. The leather was old, but well-maintained, repaired in several places with careful stitching that spoke of someone who had loved this animal. The wind chimes, Frank could see now, were made from various pieces of metal. Old spoons, small bells, pieces of wire twisted into delicate shapes. They created a harmony that was both melancholy and strangely comforting. The donkey made a soft sound, somewhere between a grunt and a sigh, and began moving again. But instead of continuing down the trail, it turned toward Frank with what seemed like expectation. As if waiting for him to follow, Frank found himself walking alongside the cart, Thunder's reins in one hand, while the other rested on the donkey's neck. The animal's pace was slow but steady, and Frank noticed that despite its obvious exhaustion, there was something determined about its movement, something that suggested it was far from its destination, but absolutely certain of its direction. After they had traveled perhaps a quarter mile, the donkey stopped abruptly and turned its head toward the cart. Frank followed its gaze and for the first time really examined the vehicle's contents. What he had assumed was merely supplies or farming equipment was actually carefully arranged personal belongings. Covered by a canvas top that had been partially pulled aside by the wind, curiosity overcame caution, and Frank gently pulled back the top to reveal the cart's contents. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A quilt lay folded on top of everything else. Not the machine-made kind sold in stores, but the type crafted by loving hands over long winter evenings. The fabric was faded, but still beautiful, composed of squares in blues and yellows that reminded Frank of Texas wildflowers. The stitching was exquisite, tiny and precise, each pattern telling a story of patience and devotion. Beneath the quilt, Frank could see other items: a wooden music box, its surface polished smooth by countless hands, a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, and something that made his heart stop: the corner of a photograph, its edges yellowed with age. With trembling fingers, Frank lifted the photograph from where it rested among the other treasures. The image was faded, the colors bleached by time, but the face that looked back at him was as familiar as his own reflection. Sarah Martinez, exactly as she had appeared 34 years ago, smiled at him from across the decades. The world seemed to tilt around Frank as memories crashed over him like a flash flood through a desert arroyo. Sarah's laugh, bright and musical, echoing across a rodeo arena. The way she had looked at him with such trust and affection, believing in a future he had been too frightened to embrace. The weight of her hand in his as they walked through San Antonio's market square, planning a life together that would never come to pass. Frank's legs gave way, and he found himself sitting heavily on the edge of the cart, the photograph clutched in his weathered hands. How had Sarah's picture ended up here, in this strange cart being pulled by a donkey through the middle of nowhere? What cosmic joke was the universe playing on him, bringing his deepest regret back to haunt him in such an unexpected way? The donkey had remained perfectly still during Frank's discovery, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Now it turned its head toward him, those intelligent dark eyes seeming to ask a question that Frank couldn't quite comprehend. Frank looked more closely at the other items in the cart. The music box was familiar, not just the type, but the specific piece itself. He reached for it with shaking hands, recognizing the delicate roses carved into its lid, the tiny brass key that still protruded from its side. This was Sarah's music box, the one her grandmother had given her, the one that played Red River Valley when wounded. The letters, too, seemed to call to him. The handwriting on the visible envelope was unfamiliar, but something about the careful script suggested education, thoughtfulness, the kind of penmanship taught in schools, but perfected through practice and care. Frank stood on unsteady legs, his mind reeling with questions that had no ready answers. The donkey watched him patiently, as if waiting for him to reach some decision. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but Frank barely noticed the heat. All of his attention was focused on the impossible contents of this mysterious cart, and the growing certainty that this encounter was no accident. Sarah was gone. Frank was sure of that much. He had never tried to contact her after leaving San Antonio, but in a community as small as theirs had been, news traveled fast. If she had still been alive, still been living in the same area, he would have heard something over the years. The aged photograph and the careful preservation of her belongings suggested this was a memorial of sorts, a collection of treasures gathered by someone who had loved her deeply. The donkey took a step forward, then looked back at Frank expectantly. The message was clear. The journey was not over, and Frank was being invited, no, required, to continue. Frank folded the photograph carefully and placed it back among the other items, then covered everything with the tarp. He gathered Thunder's reins and fell into step beside the patient donkey, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. Whatever this strange pilgrimage was, wherever it was leading, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of them, but for the first time in decades, Frank Garrison was not traveling alone. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, Frank had made the decision to camp where they were. The donkey, he found himself thinking of it as more than just an animal now, had stopped beside a cluster of mesquite trees that offered modest shade and protection from the evening wind. Frank unsaddled Thunder and hobbled him where the horse could reach the sparse grass that grew in the shelter of the trees. The donkey stood patiently while Frank unhitched it from the cart, showing none of the skittishness he might have expected from an animal traveling alone for days. Instead, it moved to where Frank had placed a bucket of water, drinking deeply but not greedily, then settling down nearby as if perfectly content to wait. The evening routine of making camp felt different with the mysterious cart sitting nearby like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Frank built a small fire from mesquite wood, more for light than warmth in the desert heat, and prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. But his attention kept returning to the canvas-covered contents of the cart, particularly to the music box that had triggered such powerful memories. As the last light faded from the sky and the desert silence settled around them, Frank finally allowed himself to examine Sarah's music box more closely. The wood was darkened with age, but the carved roses on its lid were as delicate as he remembered. His fingers found the small brass key and turned it slowly, hearing the familiar resistance of the old mechanism. When he lifted the lid, the melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful. Red River Valley played in the tinkling tones of a music box, each note pure and clear in the desert stillness. The sound transported Frank instantly back to a winter evening in San Antonio, when Sarah had played this same box while they sat before her fireplace, talking about their dreams for the future. "This was my grandmother's," Sarah had said that night, her fingers tracing the carved roses. "She told me that music boxes hold memories, that every time you play them, they remember something beautiful." Now, listening to the same melody under a canopy of desert stars, Frank felt the weight of all the memories this box must hold, not just his own, but Sarah's, and perhaps those of others he had yet to discover. The music box played its entire repertoire and wound down, leaving only the whisper of wind through the mesquite branches. Frank sat staring at the small wooden treasure, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. This wasn't just Sarah's music box, it was a piece of her life, carefully preserved and transported across the desert for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend. His hands shaking slightly, Frank reached for the bundle of letters. The blue ribbon that held them together was silk, faded but still soft to the touch. The topmost envelope bore his name in handwriting he didn't recognize. Papa Frank, written in careful, educated script. Frank's breath caught in his throat. Papa Frank! The words seemed to leap from the envelope and embed themselves in his consciousness. Someone had been calling him Papa Frank, someone who knew enough about him to use his name, but had never met him. With hands that trembled more than he cared to admit, Frank opened the first letter. The paper was good quality, cream-colored and substantial, the kind used by someone who took correspondence seriously. The date at the top read 3 years earlier. "Dear Papa Frank," the letter began, "I hope this letter finds you well, though I confess I'm not even certain it will find you at all. My name is Joshua Martinez, and I believe you knew my mother Sarah many years ago. She passed away last month, and among her belongings I found letters and photographs that led me to believe you are my father." Frank had to stop reading. The words blurred before his eyes as the full implication hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had a son. Sarah had his son. The boy, No, he would be a man now in his 30s, had been searching for him. The donkey, as if sensing Frank's distress, moved closer and settled down beside him. Frank found comfort in the animal's presence as he forced himself to continue reading. I want you to know that I harbor no resentment toward you for your absence. Mother spoke of you often, always with love and understanding. She told me that you were a good man who was afraid of being hurt, and that sometimes good men make choices they later regret. She said she forgave you long ago and hoped that someday you might forgive yourself. Frank's vision blurred with tears he hadn't shed in decades. Sarah's wisdom and generosity, even in death, reached across the years to offer him the absolution he had never dared to seek. The letter continued, revealing details about Joshua's life that filled Frank with both pride and unbearable regret. Joshua had become a teacher, following in his mother's footsteps. He had married a woman named Helen and lived in a small town north of San Antonio. He described himself as quiet and thoughtful, with his mother's patience and what he supposed might be his father's stubbornness. "I've named my donkey Faithful," Joshua wrote, "because Mother always said that hope and faithfulness could overcome any distance, any mistake. Faithful has been my companion for 5 years now, and he's the smartest animal I've ever known. Sometimes I think he understands more than he lets on." Frank looked over at the donkey, Faithful, who was watching him with those remarkably intelligent eyes. The animal's behavior suddenly made sense. This wasn't a lost beast wandering aimlessly through the desert. This was a creature on a mission, carrying precious cargo to a predetermined destination. The letter concluded with an invitation that broke Frank's heart. "If you ever find yourself in the San Antonio area, I would very much like to meet you. I have so many questions about the man who gave me life, and I think Mother would be pleased to know that we had found each other at last." Frank folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking with emotion. 3 years. Joshua had written this letter 3 years ago, reaching across time and space to offer the gift of connection. And Frank, in his stubborn isolation, had never received it because he had never given anyone the chance to find him. How many other letters were there? What had become of Joshua in the years since this was written? The questions multiplied in Frank's mind, each one more painful than the last. He reached for the second letter, dated 2 years later, and then the third. Each one revealed more about the son he had never known, a man of quiet dignity who had spent his life wondering about the father who had never come home. Joshua wrote about his work as a teacher, his love for Helen, his simple but satisfying life in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's story. But as Frank read further, he began to notice a change in the tone of the letters, references to feeling tired, to needing more rest than usual, to visits to doctors that left more questions than answers. Faithful watched patiently as Frank worked his way through the correspondence, occasionally shifting position, but never moving far from the man who was slowly learning about the family he had never known he had. The desert night pressed close around them, full of mystery and the weight of choices that could never be undone. By the time Frank reached the final letters, his understanding of the strange pilgrimage he had joined began to crystallize into something, both wonderful and terrible. The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time Frank reached the final letters in Joshua's collection. Each page revealed another piece of a life lived with quiet dignity and purpose, painting a portrait of the son Frank had never known, but already loved, with a fierce, protective ache that surprised him with its intensity. Joshua's early letters painted a picture of a childhood shaped by Sarah's wisdom and strength. He wrote about summer evenings spent in his mother's garden, learning to tend vegetables and flowers while listening to stories about the wide world beyond their small town. Sarah had raised him with a deep appreciation for education, ensuring he understood that knowledge was a treasure no one could take away. "Mother always said that you were a learned man," Joshua had written in one letter. "She told me you could read the weather like other men read newspapers, and that you knew the names of all the stars. I became a teacher partly because I hoped that someday I might understand the world the way she said you did." Frank's throat tightened as he read about Joshua's school years, a boy who excelled in his studies but was never boastful about his achievements. He had been elected class president in high school, not through popularity, but through the quiet respect he earned by helping struggling classmates with their lessons. Sarah had attended every graduation ceremony alone, proud but wistful, always saving an empty chair beside her just in case. The letters revealed that Joshua had spent years searching for Frank, following leads that often proved false or outdated. He had contacted rodeo associations, checked with ranchers across Texas and New Mexico, even hired a private investigator who had ultimately concluded that Frank Garrison had either changed his name or moved far beyond the reach of conventional searches. I want you to know I'm not searching out of anger or some need for confrontation, Joshua had written during one particularly difficult period of his quest. I simply want to understand where I came from, and to tell you that the man who raised me in absence was a good father. Mother's stories gave me a moral compass, and your example, even from afar, taught me about independence and integrity. Frank found himself smiling through his tears as he read about Joshua's college years, his decision to study education, and his first teaching position at a small elementary school. The young man's letters revealed a natural gift for connecting with children, particularly those from difficult backgrounds who reminded him of his own experience growing up without a father. It was in one of these letters that Frank first learned about Helen. Joshua described meeting her at a church social, how her kindness toward a shy student's family had caught his attention, and how their friendship had gradually deepened into something more precious. Helen has your smile, Joshua wrote, apparently responding to some observation Sarah had made. Or rather, she has the smile Mother says you had when you were happy. She lights up a room just by entering it, and she has this way of making everyone feel valued and heard. I think you would like her, Papa Frank. She never makes me feel self-conscious about not knowing my father's stories. Their wedding had been small, but joyful, held in the same church where Sarah had prayed for years that her son would find happiness. Joshua's description of the ceremony was so vivid that Frank could almost see Sarah in her good dress, dabbing at her eyes as she watched her boy become a man. We're hoping to have children someday, Joshua had written shortly after his marriage. Mother talks about becoming a grandmother with such excitement that Helen and I can't help but share her enthusiasm. I want to be the kind of father to my children that I imagined you would have been to me, present, patient, and strong enough to let them make their own mistakes. Frank's hands trembled as he read those words, realizing that Joshua had created an idealized version of the father he had never known, using that image to guide his own approach to family and responsibility. The weight of that trust, that faith in a man who had never earned it, was almost unbearable. But it was the later letters that broke Frank's heart completely. The first mention of fatigue came almost casually, buried in a description of a particularly challenging school year. Then references to headaches that wouldn't go away, to weight loss that Helen worried about, to doctor visits that raised more questions than they answered. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was delivered with the same quiet dignity that characterized all of Joshua's correspondence. A rare form of cancer that was aggressive but not painful, fast-moving but mercifully brief. The doctors gave him 6 months. He had used those months to arrange his affairs with the methodical care of a man who understood that love sometimes required difficult preparations. I want you to know that I'm not afraid, Joshua had written in one of his final letters. Mother raised me to believe that death is just another journey, and that the love we leave behind is the only immortality that matters. I am sad about leaving Helen, but I'm grateful for the time we've had together. The last letter, dated only 6 weeks earlier, revealed the true purpose of Faithful's desert pilgrimage. I have trained Faithful to find you, Papa Frank. He's remarkably intelligent and has an almost supernatural ability to navigate by instinct. I've taught him to follow the old cattle trails that lead toward the Big Bend country, where Mother always said you went when you needed to think. The cart contains everything I thought you might want to have of Mother's, along with some things of my own that I hope will help you understand the son you never met." Frank looked up from the letter to find Faithful watching him with those knowing eyes. The donkey had been trained not just to travel, but to find a specific person in a vast landscape. Joshua had somehow imbued this gentle animal with a sense of purpose that transcended normal understanding. "I don't know if you'll ever find these letters," Joshua's final message continued, "but I have faith that Faithful will complete his mission. He knows the scent of the leather in your old saddlebags. Mother kept a piece of your gear all these years. He knows your voice from the recordings Mother made of herself reading your letters aloud. Most importantly, he knows that his job is to bring you home." Frank realized that tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. Joshua was gone, had been gone for weeks, but his love and forgiveness reached across death itself to offer Frank something he had never dared to hope for, the chance to be a father. Even in loss, Faithful moved closer and gently nuzzled Frank's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that seemed to say that the real journey was just beginning. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the eastern horizon in soft pastels before the sun emerged to burn away the night's coolness. Frank woke to find Faithful standing patiently beside the cart, already harnessed and ready to continue their mysterious journey. The donkey's efficiency was both impressive and slightly unnerving, as if the animal operated according to some internal schedule that Frank was only beginning to understand. After a breakfast of coffee and jerky, Frank packed his gear and saddled Thunder. But before they resumed their trek, he found himself drawn once more to the cart's contents. Beneath Sarah's carefully folded quilt, he discovered something that made his breath catch: a small wooden horse. Carved with the loving imprecision of young hands, the toy was simple but charming, its proportions slightly off in the way that made it endearing rather than flawed. The wood had been sanded smooth and stained a rich brown, and someone had painted tiny details: a white blaze on the forehead, black hooves, a flowing mane suggested by careful knife work. On the bottom, carved in letters that spoke of painstaking effort, were the words, "For Papa Frank, from Joshua, age 8. Frank held the small horse in his weathered hands, imagining his son as a boy, working for hours with a pocket knife and sandpaper to create this gift for a father he had never met. The love and hope embedded in this simple carving was overwhelming, a child's faith that someday, somehow, his absent father would return and appreciate the offering of a young heart. 8 years old, Frank murmured to Faithful, who had turned to watch this latest discovery. "He was carving presents for me when he was 8 years old." The donkey made a soft sound that might have been agreement or comfort, then began walking northward along a trail that was barely visible to human eyes but apparently clear as a highway to his animal senses. Their second day of travel took them through terrain that grew, progressively more challenging. The relatively flat desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels from the earth. The trail Faithful followed wound between these landmarks with the precision of someone who had mapped every stone and shadow. Frank found himself talking to the donkey as they traveled, a habit that would have embarrassed him with human companions but felt natural in the vast solitude of the desert. Faithful was an excellent listener, his ears swiveling to catch Frank's words while his steady pace never faltered. "You know, Faithful," Frank said during one of their rest stops, "I always thought I was avoiding responsibility by staying alone, but I think I was really just avoiding the possibility of failing someone who mattered." The donkey's response was a gentle nudge against Frank's shoulder, the same gesture of comfort that Thunder offered on difficult mornings. But where Thunder's touch was born of long partnership, Faithful's seemed to carry a deeper message, that understanding and forgiveness were possible even across the gulf of time and regret. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had begun building on the western horizon, promising one of the sudden thunderstorms that could transform the desert from sun-baked hardpan to treacherous mud in a matter of minutes. Frank watched the approaching weather with concern. knowing that Thunder could handle rough conditions, but worried about Faithful's ability to pull the cart through challenging terrain. His concerns proved unnecessary. When the storm hit with typical desert fury, Faithful demonstrated the same intelligence that had marked his entire journey. Without guidance from Frank, the donkey led them to a natural shelter formed by an overhanging rock formation, positioning the cart so that the precious contents remained dry while the rain drummed overhead. They waited out the storm in companionable silence, Frank sharing his water and a handful of grain with both animals, while lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, dramatic flashes. During one particularly bright burst, Frank caught sight of something that made him peer more closely into the rain-lashed distance. Another traveler was approaching their shelter, a figure hunched against the storm, leading a heavily laden pack mule. As the stranger drew closer, Frank could see it was an elderly Mexican man, his weathered face creased with relief at finding refuge from the tempest. "Gracias, y señor," the man called in accented English as he guided his mule into the shelter. "This storm, she came from nowhere." Frank offered coffee from his thermos, and the stranger accepted gratefully, introducing himself as Pablo Hernandez, a trader who carried goods between small settlements scattered across the desert. "That's a fine donkey you have," Pablo observed, studying Faithful with obvious appreciation. "Very unusual markings, very intelligent eyes. I think I have seen him before, perhaps 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. Frank's attention sharpened. "You've seen him before?" Pablo nodded, sipping his coffee. "See, traveling alone with that cart. I wondered at the time where his master was, but the animal seemed to know exactly where he was going. Some people in Esperanza said they had seen him too, always heading north, always with purpose." "Esperanza? Small town, maybe 30 miles south of here. The people there, they were talking about the donkey with the wind chimes. Some thought he was a spirit animal, carrying messages from the departed. Others said he was just lost." Pablo glanced at Frank curiously. "But you are with him now, so perhaps he was not lost after all." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Faithful had been traveling for weeks, crossing hundreds of miles of desert with his precious cargo, following some internal compass that had led him directly to Frank. The precision of that navigation was beyond mere animal instinct. It suggested a training so thorough, a purpose so clear, that the donkey had become something approaching a force of nature. When the storm passed and Pablo prepared to continue his journey, he paused to study Faithful once more. "That donkey," he said thoughtfully, "he has the look of an animal with a sacred mission. In my culture, we believe such creatures are blessed by God to carry out his will. Perhaps you should listen carefully to where he wants to take you." After Pablo disappeared into the afternoon haze, Frank found himself studying Faithful with new eyes. The donkey stood quietly, water dripping from his coat, but his gaze was fixed on the northern horizon with an intensity that suggested their destination was still far ahead. Frank mounted Thunder and fell into step beside the cart, but his mind was spinning with the implications of Pablo's words. Faithful hadn't just been wandering the desert, he had been traveling a specific route, following a path that Joshua had somehow programmed into his animal intelligence. And that path had led, with seeming inevitability, to Frank. As they resumed their journey through the storm-washed landscape, Frank realized that he was no longer simply following a lost animal. He was being led home by a son's love and a donkey's faithful heart, toward a destination he couldn't yet imagine, but was beginning to trust completely. The third day of their journey dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the desert air so clean that distant mountains seemed close enough to touch. Frank woke with a sense of anticipation he couldn't quite name, as if the approaching day held some revelation that would change everything he thought he understood about his past. Faithful seemed to share this anticipation. The donkey was restless during their morning preparations, occasionally looking toward the cart's contents with what Frank had come to recognize as meaningful intent. After they had been traveling for several hours, Faithful stopped abruptly and turned his head toward the cart. making a soft sound that Frank had learned meant, "Pay attention." Frank dismounted and approached the cart, wondering what new discovery awaited him. As he lifted the canvas tarp, he noticed something he had missed before, a separate bundle wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into the corner where it would be protected from dust and rain. The package was small, but carefully prepared, sealed with wax and bearing his name in Sarah's unmistakable handwriting. With trembling fingers, Frank broke the seal and unwrapped the package. Inside was a single letter, the paper yellow with age but still intact, and beneath it, something that made his knees nearly buckle, his own letter to Sarah from 34 years ago. The coward's letter that had ended their relationship and changed the course of both their lives. Sarah's letter was dated 5 years earlier, written in the careful script of someone whose arthritis made writing difficult, but whose thoughts were still crystal clear. "My dearest Frank," it began, "if you are reading this, then Joshua's plan has worked and Faithful has found you at last. I'm writing this knowing that I will likely not live to see you again, but hoping that these words might bridge the years between us and help you understand that love doesn't diminish with distance or time." Frank had to stop reading and sit down heavily on a nearby boulder. His hands shook as he held the letter, and his vision blurred with tears he had been holding back for decades. Sarah's voice seemed to speak directly from the page, carrying the same gentle wisdom that had made him love her so desperately and fear that love so completely. "I want you to know that I have never regretted our time together, not even after you left. You gave me the greatest gift of my life in Joshua, though I know you didn't realize it at the time. Our son has been my joy and my pride, and every day I see parts of you in him, your integrity, your quiet strength, your stubborn determination to do what you think is right, even when it breaks your heart." Frank looked over at Faithful, who was standing patiently nearby, and realized that the donkey wasn't just carrying Joshua's belongings. He was carrying Sarah's final message, her last attempt to heal the wound that had shaped both their lives. The letter continued, revealing truths that Frank had never allowed himself to imagine. "I kept your letter all these years, not because I wanted to nurse old hurts, but because I hoped that someday you might want to know how I responded to it. You wrote that you weren't ready for marriage and might never be, that I deserved better than a worn-out cowboy with more scars than sense. But Frank, you never asked me what I thought I deserved." Frank's breath came in ragged gasps as he read Sarah's response to his decades-old fears. "I deserved a man who loved me enough to stay, yes. But I also deserved the chance to love a man who was honest about his fears. You thought you were protecting me by leaving, but you robbed us both of the chance to grow brave together." The words cut deep because they revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven Frank away. He had assumed that Sarah needed someone who was already strong, already certain, already worthy of her love. He had never considered that she might prefer someone who was willing to become those things with her help and patience. "I told Joshua about you from the time he was old enough to understand," Sarah's letter revealed. "I told him about your kindness to animals, your respect for the land, your ability to see beauty in harsh places. I told him about the way you looked at the stars as if they were old friends, and how you could gentle the wildest. Horse with nothing but patience and understanding." Frank realized that the image Joshua had of his father, the idealized version that had guided the young man's own approach to life, had been carefully crafted by Sarah's love and forgiveness. She had given their son not a bitter story of abandonment, but a tale of a good man who had lost his way. Most importantly, the letter continued, "I told Joshua that fear is not a character flaw. It's a sign that something matters deeply to us. You were afraid of failing me, which meant you loved me enough to want to succeed. That fear doesn't make you weak, Frank. It makes you human." Frank found himself sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief, from a place where regret and relief and overwhelming gratitude fought for space in his heart. Faithful approached quietly and rested his warm muzzle against Frank's shoulder, offering the comfort of presence without judgment. As Frank read the final paragraphs of Sarah's letter, he realized that this desert pilgrimage was more than a son's last gift to an absent father. It was Sarah's final attempt to heal the wound she had carried for 34 years. Her last chance to offer the forgiveness Frank had never thought to seek. I am dying peacefully, knowing that Joshua will try to find you, and knowing that you are somewhere under these same stars, still wrestling with the same fears that drove you away. I hope that when Faithful completes his mission, you will understand that love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. It's never too late to come home. Frank, it's never too late to forgive yourself. The letter was signed simply, "All my love, always." Sarah, followed by a postscript that broke Frank's heart completely. P.S. I still have that piece of your leather gear. Sometimes I hold it when I miss you, and it still smells like sage and freedom and the man I never stopped loving. Frank sat in the desert silence, holding the letter and feeling something fundamental shift inside him. For 34 years, he had carried the weight of his choice like a stone in his chest. Now, with Sarah's words washing over him like cool water in the desert heat, he began to understand that redemption had been waiting for him all along, not as something he had to earn, but as something that had already been freely given. Faithful stood patiently beside him, the desert wind chiming softly through the metal pieces hanging from his harness, creating a melody that sounded like forgiveness made audible. Frank realized that this journey was transforming him from the inside out, turning him from a man running from love into someone finally brave enough to walk toward it. Frank carefully folded Sarah's letter and placed it back in its protective wrapping. But as he did so, his fingers encountered something else in the oiled cloth, a manila envelope that felt substantial and official. The envelope bore the seal of a law office in a town Frank had never heard of, and his name was typed across the front in formal legal script. Inside the envelope, Frank found documents that made his hands shake even more violently than Sarah's letter had. The top sheet was a property deed, executed 6 months earlier, transferring ownership of 47 acres of land near Comfort, Texas, from Joshua Martinez to Frank Garrison. The property description included a small farmhouse, outbuildings, and water rights to a section of Cypress Creek. Below the deed were more documents, a will, bank statements, and a detailed letter from Joshua's attorney explaining the legal arrangements that had been made. But it was the final document that truly staggered Frank, a private investigator's report dated 3 years earlier, containing photographs, property records, and detailed information about Frank's daily routines at his ranch near Redemption Flats. Frank sank down onto the boulder again, the implications of these documents crashing over him like a tidal wave. Joshua hadn't been searching for him unsuccessfully all those years. Joshua had found him. The young man had hired a professional investigator who had not only located Frank, but had compiled a comprehensive dossier on his life and habits. The investigator's report was thorough and respectful, clearly the work of someone who understood that this was a delicate family matter rather than a standard surveillance case. It included photographs of Frank working around his ranch, detailed observations of his relationship with Thunder, and even notes about his weekly visits to May's Diner in Redemption Flats. One particular passage made Frank's throat tighten. Subject appears to be a solitary individual who maintains his property meticulously and treats his animals with obvious affection. Local residents describe him as reliable and trustworthy, but intensely private. Bar owner May Sullivan reports that subject occasionally appears lonely, but becomes withdrawn when others attempt to engage him in personal conversation. Assessment. Subject maintains psychological barriers consistent with deep-seated fear of emotional vulnerability. Joshua had known exactly where Frank was, exactly how he lived, exactly what kind of man he had become. And instead of showing up at Frank's door with accusations or demands, Joshua had chosen a different path entirely. The attorney's letter explained Joshua's reasoning in language that was both legal and deeply personal. Mr. Martinez was very specific about his wishes regarding his biological father. He stated that he had observed Mr. Garrison's lifestyle and personality from a distance and concluded that a direct confrontation would likely result in further estrangement. Instead, Mr. Martinez wanted to provide his father with the opportunity to choose connection without pressure or obligation. Frank looked up at Faithful, who was watching him with those remarkable eyes, and realized that every aspect of this journey had been carefully planned. Joshua hadn't just trained the donkey to find Frank, he had orchestrated an elaborate scenario designed to give Frank the one thing he had never allowed himself, the chance to approach love and family on his own terms. The property Joshua had left him was located near Comfort, Texas, a small town about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. According to the documentation, it included Sarah's final resting place, a small family cemetery on a hill overlooking Cypress Creek. Joshua had purchased the land specifically because it contained his mother's grave, and he had lived there for the last 5 years of his life, tending the property and preparing it for the father he hoped would someday come home. A detailed map showed the route from Frank's current location to the inherited property, and Frank realized that Faithful was following the exact path marked on that map. The donkey's supernatural sense of direction wasn't supernatural at all. It was the result of careful training and repetitive practice. Joshua had spent months, maybe years, teaching Faithful to navigate by landmarks and instinct to complete this final mission. But perhaps the most revealing document was a personal letter from Joshua to his attorney, written just weeks before his death. "I want to be very clear about my intentions regarding my father. I'm not trying to manipulate him or force a relationship that he doesn't want. I'm simply offering him what I wish someone had offered me during my search: information, understanding, and the freedom to choose." The letter continued with insights that demonstrated Joshua's deep understanding of the man who had fathered him. "My father is a good man who made a decision based on fear rather than malice. He has spent 34 years believing that he failed my mother and me, when the truth is that his absence taught me valuable lessons about independence and self-reliance. I don't need him to feel guilty about the past. I just want him to know that he has family if he wants it." Frank found himself laughing through his tears at Joshua's next words. "I've observed my father long enough to know that he responds to animals better than he does to people, and that he trusts actions more than words. Faithful will carry more than just my belongings to him. He'll carry proof that love can be patient, that forgiveness can travel any distance, and that some gifts are worth waiting a lifetime to receive." The final section of Joshua's letter to his attorney revealed the true depth of his planning. "If my father chooses to accept the property, he'll find that I've prepared it for him in every detail. The farmhouse has been restored, but kept simple, the way I believe he would prefer. The barn is suitable for horses, and there's a workshop equipped for leather repair and other crafts I've observed him practicing. Most importantly, the property includes the creek where my mother used to take me fishing when I was small, and where she told me the most wonderful stories about the cowboy who captured her heart." Frank realized that Joshua had been preparing for this moment for years, crafting a gift so perfect and so understanding that it could bridge the gap between strangers who shared the deepest possible connection. The farm wasn't just an inheritance, it was a love letter written in wood and stone, and careful attention to detail. The investigators' report included one final observation that brought everything into sharp focus. Subject's daily routines suggest a man who has structured his life to avoid disappointment, but who retains a deep capacity for love and loyalty. Recommend approach through gradual revelation rather than direct confrontation. Subject appears most comfortable when allowed to process emotional information at his own pace. Joshua had understood his father completely, perhaps better than Frank understood himself. The elaborate journey with Faithful, the gradual revelation of letters and artifacts, the careful pacing of discoveries, all of it had been designed to give Frank time to adjust, to process, to choose his own response without feeling cornered or manipulated. Frank stood up slowly, the legal documents still clutched in his hands, and looked around at the desert landscape that had been his refuge for so many years. The vast emptiness that had once felt like freedom now seemed like the walls of a prison he had built around his own heart. Faithful made a soft sound and began walking again, his pace slightly faster now, as if sensing that their destination was finally within reach. Frank mounted Thunder and fell into step beside the cart, but his mind was reeling with the magnitude of what Joshua had done. His son had found him, understood him, loved him, and forgiven him without ever demanding anything in return. Joshua had spent his final months preparing a place where Frank could choose to be part of a family, even if that family consisted only of memories and the love of a son who had died too young. As they crested a small hill, Frank caught sight of something in the distance that made his heart skip. A farmhouse nestled among oak trees, with a barn and outbuildings that looked exactly like the pictures in the legal documents. Faithful's step quickened, and Frank realized that they were approaching the end of their journey and the beginning of something he had never dared to hope for, the chance to come home. The farmhouse emerged from the landscape like something out of Frank's long-buried dreams, a simple, well-maintained structure that spoke of care and permanence rather than grandeur. White clapboard siding gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the wraparound porch was furnished with wooden chairs that invited long conversations and quiet contemplation. A red barn stood nearby, its paint fresh enough to suggest recent attention, and beyond it, Frank could see the glint of water where Cypress Creek wound through a grove of ancient oak trees. Faithful's pace had become eager now, his ears pricked forward with unmistakable recognition. As they approached the farmhouse, the donkey's wind chimes created a welcoming melody that seemed to announce their arrival to the peaceful valley. Frank found his own heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and profound uncertainty about what he was walking into. The first thing Frank noticed as they drew closer was the meticulous care with which everything had been maintained. The fence posts were straight and recently replaced where necessary. The gates hung true on their hinges, and the gravel driveway was free of weeds and ruts. This was the work of someone who took pride in his property and understood that love could be expressed through attention to detail. Faithful led them directly to the front porch, where he stopped and turned expectantly toward Frank. Hanging from a hook beside the front door was a small wooden sign that made Frank's throat constrict. "Welcome home, Papa Frank." Below it, a sealed envelope bore his name in Joshua's careful handwriting. Frank dismounted on unsteady legs and approached the envelope with hands that shook with emotion. Inside, he found a brass key and a brief note. "This is your home now, if you want it to be. Everything inside was prepared with you in mind. Take all the time you need to explore and decide. Faithful knows where the barn is, and Thunder will be comfortable there. All my love, your son Joshua." The key felt warm in Frank's palm as he approached the front door, and for a moment he hesitated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to discover. This wasn't just Joshua's home. It was the life his son had built while thinking about the father who might someday join him. The front door opened easily, revealing an interior that took Frank's breath away. The main room was simple but beautifully appointed, with handcrafted furniture that showed both skill and affection. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with photographs that chronicled a life Frank had never been part of, but could now witness in careful detail. The photographs told the story of Joshua and Helen's marriage, their quiet happiness evident in every candid shot. But what made Frank's knees weak was the realization that many of the photos included an empty chair positioned as if waiting for someone. In wedding pictures, family gatherings, holiday celebrations, there was always a place set for the absent father, always a space held open with patient hope. Moving through the house felt like walking through a museum dedicated to love and possibility. The kitchen was equipped with simple, practical items, but Frank noticed that the dining table had 4 chairs rather than 2. Again, room for the family that might someday be complete. The bedrooms were modestly furnished, but one had clearly been prepared as a guest room with masculine touches that spoke of careful consideration for Frank's potential preferences. In what had obviously been Joshua's study, Frank found treasures that brought him to his knees. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing works on education, agriculture, and Western history, but one shelf was devoted entirely to books about rodeo, ranching, and cowboy culture. Joshua had clearly spent years trying to understand the world that had shaped his father. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, open to an entry dated just months before Joshua's death. "Helen and I finished preparing the guest room today. I keep wondering if Papa Frank will like the view of the creek from that window, or if he'll prefer the workshop in the barn where he can work with leather and feel useful. I want him to know that this isn't charity, it's family. There's a difference between taking care of someone and making space for them to belong." Frank sank into the chair at Joshua's desk, overwhelmed by the depth of thought and love that had gone into every detail of this preparation. His son hadn't just inherited property, he had created a sanctuary designed specifically for a man he had never met but understood with startling accuracy. The workshop that Joshua mentioned was indeed remarkable. The barn had been carefully converted to include a spacious area equipped with leatherworking tools, many of them antique but lovingly maintained. Hanging on the walls were examples of fine craftsmanship, saddles, bridles, and other gear that Joshua had apparently collected with his father in mind. A note attached to one particularly beautiful saddle explained, "I thought you might enjoy restoring these pieces. The leather still has life in it, like all things that were made with love." As Frank explored the property, he began to notice other visitors. An elderly woman approached from the neighboring farm, her face kind but curious. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell and explained that she had been Joshua and Helen's nearest neighbor. "You must be Frank," she said with a warmth that suggested Joshua had prepared even his neighbors for this possibility. "Joshua talked about you often, always with such hope. He was convinced that someday you'd find your way." Here, Mrs. Hartwell shared memories that painted a picture of Joshua as a beloved member of the small community, a teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, a neighbor who always appeared when someone needed help with harvest or repairs, a man whose quiet wisdom had made him a natural counselor for people facing difficult decisions. "He never spoke bitterly about your absence," she told Frank, as they stood in the shade of the oak trees. "He always said that some people need more time to find their way home, and that love means being patient while they figure it out. He was the most patient man I ever knew." As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself drawn to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. The plot was carefully tended, surrounded by a white picket fence that enclosed 3 graves. Sarah's headstone was simple but elegant, bearing her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Mother and Teacher, she saw beauty in all things." Beside her lay Joshua's grave, marked with similar simplicity, "Beloved Son and Husband, he saw potential in all people." The 3rd grave was unmarked, its headstone blank, and Frank realized with a shock that it had been prepared for him. Joshua had made space for his father even in death, offering him a permanent place in the family even if he arrived too late to be part of it in life. Frank stood at Sarah's grave as the sun began to set, finally able to have the conversation he should have had 34 years earlier. He told her about his fears, his regrets, his amazement at the son she had raised without him. He apologized for his cowardice and thanked her for the forgiveness she had offered, even when he hadn't known how to ask for it. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home," he whispered to the gathering dusk. "But I'm here now, and I promise you I won't waste this second chance." As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees, and Frank felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't experienced since the night he had walked away from everything he loved. When he returned to the farmhouse, Frank found that Faithful had made himself at home in the barn. sharing space comfortably with Thunder, as if the two horses had been companions for years rather than days. The donkey's mission was nearly complete, but he seemed content to rest and recover from his long journey. That night, Frank sat on the front porch in one of Joshua's chairs, watching stars emerge in the clear Texas sky. The creek murmured softly in the distance, and somewhere an owl called to its mate with patient persistence. This was what peace felt like, Frank realized. Not the absence of challenges, but the presence of belonging. He thought about the choice that lay before him. He could return to his ranch near Redemption Flats, to the solitude and self-reliance that had defined his adult life. Or he could accept Joshua's gift and try to become the man his son had always believed him to be, someone capable of love, worthy of family, brave enough to let others care for him. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Frank had spent 34 years running from the possibility of belonging somewhere. He was too old and too tired to keep running, and too overwhelmed by love to turn away from it again. Faithful appeared at the edge of the porch, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The donkey's mission was complete, but Frank realized that his own journey was just beginning. He had found his way home, but now he had to learn how to live there. Frank woke before dawn on his first morning at Joshua's farm, drawn from sleep by the unfamiliar sound of Cypress Creek flowing past the house. The bed in the guest room, his room, he reminded himself, was more comfortable than anything he had slept on in years, but comfort wasn't what kept him awake. His mind churned with the weight of decisions that needed to be made, and the growing realization that this peaceful valley represented more than just shelter. It represented the chance to become someone he had never allowed himself to be. After making coffee in Joshua's kitchen, Frank found himself drawn once again to explore the house more thoroughly. In the morning light, details he had missed the day before revealed themselves with startling clarity. The furniture wasn't just functional. It was crafted with the kind of patient attention that spoke of love made manifest in wood and fabric. Every piece seemed chosen or made with Frank's potential comfort in mind. From the height of the chairs to the placement of reading lamps that would accommodate aging eyes. In Joshua's bedroom, Frank discovered a dresser that had clearly belonged to his son, but now held clothes in Frank's size. Simple, practical garments that suggested Joshua had somehow known even his father's measurements and preferences. The thoughtfulness was overwhelming, but what broke Frank's composure completely was what he found in the top drawer. A small wooden box, handmade and polished to a soft glow. Inside the box, nestled in blue velvet, lay a woman's wedding ring. The gold band was simple but elegant, worn thin in places by years of faithful wear. Frank recognized it immediately as Sarah's ring, the one she had worn during the 3 years of their courtship, when he had been too proud and too frightened to make their engagement official. Beside the ring lay a folded paper in Joshua's handwriting. Frank's hands trembled as he opened what would be his son's final message to him. "Papa Frank, if you're reading this, it means you've decided to stay, at least for now. This ring belonged to Mother, but she always said it was meant to be passed down through our family when the time was right. She wore it as a promise ring during the years she hoped you would propose. And after you left, she kept it as a symbol of the love that was real, even if it couldn't find its proper expression. I'm not giving this to you as a burden or a reminder of what you lost. I'm giving it to you as a gift of possibility. Mother always believed that you would find love again when you stopped running from it, and she wanted you to have something beautiful to offer when that moment came. The ring has been sized for a woman with small hands, Mother's hands, but it can be resized. What matters isn't the fit, but the intention behind it. When you find someone who makes you brave instead of afraid, someone who sees your scars as evidence of a life fully lived rather than reasons to turn away. Give her this ring and the story that comes with it. Tell her about Sarah, who loved a cowboy enough to forgive his fears. Tell her about me, who spent his life grateful for the father who gave him existence, even from a distance. Most importantly, tell her about yourself, not the man you think you should have been, but the man you are now, shaped by loss and seasoned by solitude, but still capable of extraordinary love. This isn't about replacing what you had with Mother. It's about honoring it by refusing to let fear win again. You deserve companionship in your remaining years. Papa Frank, you deserve someone to share sunsets with, someone to read to when your eyes get tired, someone to help you tend Mother's garden when your back gets stiff. I've seen you from a distance, and I know you think you're too old, too set in your ways, too damaged by regret to start over. But love doesn't require perfection, it only requires presence. And you're here now, which means you've already taken the hardest step. The ring is my gift to your future, whatever that might look like. Use it wisely, use it bravely, and when you do, know that somewhere beyond the stars, a mother and son are celebrating your courage to love again. Frank closed his eyes and pressed the ring against his chest, feeling the weight of 3 generations of love and hope concentrated in one small circle of gold. Joshua's final gift wasn't just the ring. It was permission to imagine a future that included joy rather than just endurance. Through the bedroom window, Frank could see Faithful grazing peacefully in the pasture beside Thunder. The 2 animals, having formed the kind of instant friendship that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. The donkey's long journey was over, his mission accomplished, but he seemed content to stay and become part of this new chapter in Frank's story. Frank pocketed the ring and walked outside to where Faithful stood in the morning sunshine. The donkey looked up at his approach, and Frank could swear he saw satisfaction in those intelligent eyes, the look of a job well done. A promise kept, a family finally brought together. "Well, old friend," Frank said softly, stroking Faithful's neck, "what do you think? Should we stay?" Faithful's response was a gentle nudge against Frank's shoulder, the same gesture of comfort and encouragement that had sustained them both through their desert pilgrimage. But now it felt like something more, like a blessing, like approval, like the quiet certainty that some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to. Frank spent the morning exploring the farm more thoroughly, discovering details that revealed the depth of Joshua's planning and the breadth of his hope. In the workshop, he found leather-working projects left half-finished, as if Joshua had been preparing work that he and Frank might complete together. The garden behind the house showed signs of careful tending, with vegetables and herbs planted in neat rows that would provide more food than one person could reasonably consume. But it was in Joshua's study, as Frank sorted through papers and photographs, that he made the discovery that would forever change his understanding of what family meant. Hidden in a manila folder marked, "For Papa Frank, when ready," he found documents that made his heart stop completely. The first item was a birth certificate for Emma Grace Martinez, born 2 years earlier to Joshua and Helen Martinez. Frank stared at the document, reading and rereading the words until their meaning finally penetrated his consciousness. He had a granddaughter. Somewhere in the world lived a 2-year-old child who carried his blood, his legacy, his hope for the future. Beneath the birth certificate lay photographs that brought tears to Frank's eyes. The first showed Joshua and Helen in a hospital room, both of them glowing with exhaustion and joy as they cradled a tiny baby. Helen was everything Joshua had described in his letters, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that lit up the room. But it was the baby who captured Frank's attention completely. Emma had Frank's eyes, the same grey-blue color that looked back at him from mirrors and old photographs. She had Sarah's delicate features and what appeared to be Joshua's thoughtful expression, even in sleep. The photograph was inscribed on the back, "Emma meets her daddy for the first time. She already has your eyes, Papa Frank. Love, Joshua and Helen." More photographs followed, chronicling Emma's first 2 years of life. Frank saw her first smile, her first steps, her first birthday celebration, where an empty chair sat beside the table. Once again, space held for the grandfather she had never met. In every image, Emma appeared to be a happy, curious child, surrounded by love and laughter. But the most devastating discovery came in the form of a letter addressed to him from Helen. Dated just weeks after Joshua's funeral, "Dear Mr. Garrison, Joshua told me about his plan to have Faithful find you, though I wasn't sure I believed such a thing was possible. If you're reading this, I suppose it means that miracles still happen, and that love really can travel any distance. I want you to know that Joshua spoke of you every day, always with love and always with hope. He told Emma stories about her grandfather who lived under the big sky and knew how to gentle wild horses with patience and kindness. She's too young to understand the words, but she listens with the same intense attention that Joshua inherited from you. I'm writing this not to burden you with obligation, but to offer you a choice. Emma and I live quietly in Austin, where I teach at a small school, much like the one where Joshua worked. We have a simple but happy life, and we're not in need of rescue or charity. But we do have room in our hearts for family, if you want to be part of hers. I know that showing up in our lives would require tremendous courage on your part. You would be risking rejection, judgment, or the pain of discovering that we don't live up to the family you've imagined. But you would also be giving Emma the chance to know her grandfather, and giving yourself the opportunity to experience the joy that comes from watching a child discover the world. The choice is entirely yours, and I promise that whatever you decide will be accepted with understanding. Joshua taught me that love means wanting what's best for someone else, even when that might not include you. But he also taught me that fear of rejection can rob us of beautiful possibilities if we let it. If you decide you'd like to meet Emma, I've included our address and phone number. We're in no hurry. Take all the time you need to decide. But know that a little girl carries your eyes and your stubborn streak, and that she might grow up wondering about the grandfather who was brave enough to find his way home. Frank set the letter down with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice before him. Helen's words were generous and understanding, but they couldn't diminish the terrifying vulnerability required to reach out to a family who knew him only through stories and photographs. He walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful valley where Joshua had prepared a sanctuary for second chances. Faithful grazed contentedly in the pasture, his long journey complete, but his presence a constant reminder that some missions are worth any hardship. Frank thought about the man he had been just days earlier, isolated, bitter, convinced that his choices had closed all doors to love and family. Then he thought about the man Joshua had seen in him, the grandfather Helen was willing to welcome, the legacy Sarah had believed was worth preserving. The decision, when it came, required every ounce of courage Frank had ever possessed. But for the first time in his life, his desire to connect was stronger than his fear of rejection. He sat down at Joshua's desk, took out a piece of paper, and began to write, "Dear Helen and Emma, my name is Frank Garrison, and I believe I'm Emma's grandfather." 6 months later, Frank stood on the front porch of what he now thought of as home, watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. The coffee in his hands was still hot, steam rising in the cool autumn air, and beside him, Faithful dozed peacefully in a patch of sunlight. The donkey had earned his rest, his mission was complete, and he had settled into retirement with the contentment of a job well done. The farm had changed under Frank's care, but not dramatically. He had made improvements with the same thoughtful attention that Joshua had shown, adding practical touches that enhanced rather than altered his son's vision. A new fence enclosed a larger pasture for Thunder and Faithful, both animals thriving in their new home. The workshop buzzed with activity as Frank discovered a talent for leather restoration that had lain dormant for decades, but the most significant change was the new set of wind chimes that hung from the porch eaves. Not the mournful metal pieces that had once announced Faithful's approach across the desert, but carefully crafted wooden chimes that Frank had made himself. Their music was softer, more hopeful than their predecessors, creating melodies that spoke of peace rather than loss. Helen's response to his letter had arrived 3 weeks after he sent it, and her words had been everything he had hoped for and more. She had written with Joshua's same gentle wisdom, expressing gratitude for his courage in reaching out and cautiously optimistic about the possibility of connection. They had begun a careful correspondence, sharing stories and photographs, building a foundation of understanding that might eventually support the weight of family. The first phone call had been awkward, but promising. Emma's voice in the background, babbling toddler words punctuated by delighted giggles, had made Frank's heart ache with longing. Helen had patiently answered his questions about Emma's development, her personality, her favorite stories, gradually painting a picture of a child who was curious, stubborn, and surprisingly gentle with animals, traits that made Frank smile with recognition. The day of their first meeting had arrived with all the terror and anticipation Frank had expected. Helen had driven from Austin with Emma, approaching the farm on a crisp Saturday morning when the oak trees were just beginning to turn colors. Frank had spent the previous evening in a state of nervous preparation, changing clothes 3 times and rehearsing conversations that sounded stilted and unnatural. But when Helen's car pulled into the driveway and Emma emerged in a pink dress with grass stains on the knees, all of Frank's carefully prepared words had evaporated. The little girl had looked at him with those familiar grey-blue eyes, tilted her head in consideration, and then run directly to Faithful with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who instinctively understood that this was a place where she was safe and welcome. Donkey, Emma had announced with 2-year-old authority, wrapping her small arms around Faithful's neck. The old animal had stood perfectly still, as if understanding the precious nature of his burden, and Frank had known in that moment that his fears about not knowing how to be a grandfather were unfounded. Love, it turned out, required presence more than expertise. Helen had watched this interaction with tears in her eyes, later telling Frank that Joshua would have been overjoyed to see his daughter and father connecting through the animal that had brought them together. That first visit had lasted only a few hours, but it had established a foundation that grew stronger with each subsequent meeting. Now, as Frank watched a hawk circle lazily above the creek, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man who had once fled from the possibility of family now found himself eagerly anticipating Emma's visits, planning activities they could share and projects she might enjoy when she was older. He had installed a swing set near the oak trees and was already sketching plans for a treehouse that would be ready by the time Emma was old, enough to appreciate it, the photograph Joshua had given him. Sarah's image, yellowed with age, now sat in a place of honor on the kitchen table, but it was no longer a symbol of regret. Instead, it had become a reminder of the love that had made everything else possible, the foundation upon which his second chance was built. Frank had even begun to consider Helen's gentle suggestions about meeting other people in the community, perhaps attending church suppers or local gatherings where he might discover that companionship was possible at any age. Sarah's ring rested in his pocket during these outings, not as a burden, but as a promise to her memory, to Joshua's hope, and to his own future. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Frank's attention to the road. A pickup truck had stopped near his mailbox, and the driver was clearly lost, consulting a map with obvious frustration. Frank recognized the signs, someone far from home, struggling with unfamiliar territory. Perhaps a little afraid of asking for help, without hesitation, Frank set down his coffee and walked toward the road, Faithful falling into step beside him as if understanding that their help was needed. As he approached the truck, Frank saw an elderly man behind the wheel, his face creased with worry and exhaustion. "Morning," Frank called out with the easy courtesy that had replaced his former reclusiveness. "Looks like you might need some directions." The man's relief was evident as he rolled down his window. "I'm trying to find my daughter's place," he explained. "Haven't seen her in 15 years, and I'm not even sure she wants to see me now. But I figured it was time to stop being a stubborn old fool and try to make things right." Frank smiled, recognizing something of his former self in the stranger's words. "Well, sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the best destinations," he said. "Let me take a look at that address and see if I can point you in the right direction." As he helped the lost traveler find his way home, Frank realized that his own transformation was complete. He had become the kind of man who offered help rather than hiding from connection, who believed in second chances because he had been blessed with one himself. The desert wind that had once carried him away from love now carried the music of his hand-carved chimes, creating melodies that welcomed rather than mourned, that celebrated the courage required to come home.